Don't touch me right now. She didn't scream it. She didn't breathe it like a plea. She delivered it the way someone delivers a line. They've been rehearsing privately for weeks. Flat, deliberate, without looking at me. And I stood there with one hand still suspended in the air, hovering just above the curve of her shoulder, like a fool who had walked into the wrong room and hadn't figured it out yet. In that stillness, something in my brain did the math before I could stop it. 53 days. 53 days since I had last touched my wife. Not a brushed hand passing a mug across the kitchen counter. Not a sleepy, accidental leg pressed against hers on the couch. Not even one of those half-asleep, barely conscious embraces in the dark. That don't count as intimacy, but still mean everything. 53 days of nothing. And I had somehow convinced myself that was just a phase. Just the weather of a long marriage. Just the natural cooling that happens when two people have been breathing the same air for too many years. She was wearing the dark olive zip-up I'd ordered for her birthday 2 Februaries ago. Her hair was still damp, and there was a smell on her, subtle, but wrong. The way a wrong note in a familiar song is subtle, but impossible to unhear. It wasn't my cologne. It wasn't anything I owned. I knew every scent in that house, and this one did not belong. I took a step back, not out of anger, out of something closer to the vertigo you get when you realize you've been standing at the edge of something, without knowing it. The walls were the same warm gray we'd chosen together, from 100 paint swatches. The kitchen cabinet was still missing its handle. I kept meaning to fix it. The rug in the hallway still had the faint shadow of a wine spill from New Year's Eve 3 years back. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Everything was entirely different. She turned away from me like the moment had already been filed and forgotten. She opened the refrigerator, stared into it, then said, without turning around, that we were out of almond milk. And could I pick some up this week? I was still standing where she'd left me, one hand slowly lowering to my side. And she was asking about almond milk. That's when her phone lit up on the counter. A notification preview. Just a sliver of text visible before the screen went dark again. I wasn't trying to read it. I didn't need to. The words burned themselves into me in the half-second they were visible. Still thinking about this morning. You are something else. No name. Just a small red heart. The kind that means the sender already knows exactly how it will land. She didn't see me read it. She was already comparing yogurt expiration dates. She was already somewhere else entirely. I walked out the front door without saying a word. Past the copper mailbox I'd spent a weekend repainting for her. Because she'd mentioned once, only once, that she'd always wanted one that matched the shutters. Past the hedge she'd asked me not to park too close to. I walked without direction, without destination, through the neighborhood we'd chosen together 6 years ago. Because she liked the old maple trees. And I liked that the school district had good test scores. Even though we never did have children. I walked until my calves were burning. And the tightness in my throat had become something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore either. That night, I slept in the guest room. She didn't ask why. The next morning, before I'd even had coffee, I saw that she'd posted a photo on her social media. A close-up of her ceramic mug on the windowsill, steam curling upward, the morning light hitting it just so. The caption said, "New chapter, new light." I was still in the house. She hadn't left, but she had written herself into a new story already. And I wasn't in it. I understood then with the cold clarity of someone finally reading a document they've been avoiding, that she wasn't planning to leave. She was planning to stay and make me invisible while she did. That was the day I stopped waiting for her to come back to me. That was the day I started paying very close attention instead. I lay in the guest room that first night listening for her. Not hoping exactly, but listening. For footsteps in the hall. For the small creak the third floorboard makes when someone steps on it with their right foot. For any sign that she'd noticed my absence from her bed and cared even slightly. The house gave me nothing back, but the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional click of the heat cycling on. At 2 in the morning, I picked up my phone and scrolled through old messages between us. Months and months of them. There was a message from 18 months ago, where she'd written, without any prompt, without any occasion, "You make the ordinary feel chosen." I stared at that for a long time. I thought about who that woman had been. I thought about where she'd gone. And then I thought about the notification on the counter, the red heart, the damp hair, the cologne that wasn't mine. And I made a decision about the kind of quiet I was going to be going forward. It would not be the quiet of someone who didn't notice. It would be the quiet of someone who was building something. She hummed in the kitchen the next morning. Actually hummed some upbeat song I didn't recognize, while she made herself a smoothie and packed a tote bag with her gym clothes. Her phone buzzed on the counter while she had her back turned, and I counted the vibrations without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the time the fifth one came, she was already reaching for it and stepping out of the kitchen into the hallway, and the sound of her voice when she answered was different, lighter, careless in a way she hadn't been around me in longer than I could accurately remember. I knew that laugh once. I used to be the reason for it. I didn't confront her. I want to be very specific about that, because it matters. Confrontation at that point would have handed her the script. She was already prepared to perform. She would have denied, deflected, pivoted, and then somehow made me feel like the one who needed to apologize for paying attention. I had no interest in walking into that particular trap. Instead, I began documenting. It sounds clinical, cold, but it was the only way I knew to trust myself. When you live inside something long enough, you start to wonder if you're interpreting it correctly. You start to wonder if the distance you feel is real or imagined, if the signs you're reading are actually there, or constructed by a mind that's looking for reasons to hurt. I needed a record, not for lawyers, not for anyone else, for me, so that I could look at it and know that I hadn't invented this. I saved screenshots when her phone screen lit up, and I was near enough to catch the preview. I noted dates and times and partial names that appeared. I cross-referenced her stated schedule against the timestamps on photos she posted, and found inconsistencies I would have forgiven with an explanation, but never received one. I was meticulous. I was patient. And I was learning things about the architecture of the life she'd been building that shocked me even in my most cynical moments. 3 weeks after the night I slept in the guest room for the first time, she told me she had signed up for an evening ceramics workshop downtown. Tuesday nights, 2 hours. She said it would be good for her creatively. She said it with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the explanation just enough to make it sound unplanned. I said that sounded nice. I offered to drive her so she wouldn't have to worry about parking. She said no with a smile that was half warmth and half warning. Something about how I'd be bored, and how she liked the walk from the garage. I waited 40 minutes after she left. Then I drove a route I'd mapped in advance, kept distance, used surface streets instead of the main road, and followed until she turned into the underground parking lot of a boutique hotel called the Thornwood. White stone facade, ivy on the eastern wall, the kind of place that costs enough to signal discretion. I parked across the street. I watched. She came out of the stairwell side entrance, not the elevator bank, which told me she'd parked in a specific spot, one she'd used before. She was carrying a small bag in a matte burgundy color, from a boutique she'd once said was too expensive and too showy for her taste. She'd apparently reconsidered. A man came around the corner from the valet area. He wore a well-cut dark jacket, the kind that fits someone who pays attention to fit. He didn't rush toward her. He moved like someone who had already established the right to be unhurried around her. They didn't touch on the street. They didn't need to. The entire language of their body movement said that touching would come once the door closed. I took one photograph. Just one. I didn't need more. When she came home that night, her hair still slightly damp from a shower she'd taken. Somewhere that wasn't our bathroom, I was sitting at the dining table with a glass of water and an open book I hadn't been reading. I asked her how the ceramics class went. She said it was wonderful. She said they'd worked on asymmetrical forms. She said the instructor was brilliant. I told her that was interesting because she'd forgotten to bring home anything she'd made. Something moved across her face. Very fast. Very small. She recovered immediately. Told me the pieces needed more kiln time. She smiled. She went to the kitchen. I heard her fill a glass of water. I closed my book and went to bed. She didn't follow. 2 days later, I discovered she had installed a secondary lock on the interior of the bedroom door. She'd done it while I was at work. A small sliding bolt near the top of the frame, painted the same color as the wood, so that you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking. I stood in the doorway of what had been our bedroom for 6 years, and stared at that bolt for a very long time. Then I went downstairs and quietly installed a camera in the housing of the porch light. Small, wireless, pointed at the front door and the driveway. And then I remembered something. A shared calendar account we'd set up when we got married, so we could coordinate schedules easily. She had either forgotten the account existed or assumed I never checked it. She was wrong about the second thing. I began checking it every evening. What I found there was not a calendar. It was a confession. Events marked as work dinners on evenings. When I later confirmed, through her company's publicly posted calendar, that there were no such meetings. Wellness retreats on weekends, where I later found geotag data from her own photos that placed her in a city 2 hours north of where any retreat would reasonably be held. A recurring Tuesday appointment labeled ceramics that had begun long before she told me about any ceramics class. I added none of this to my documentation with anger. I added it with the focused detachment of someone assembling a case. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with it. I just knew that I was not going to be the man who woke up one day to a lawyer's letter and realized he'd been the last to understand his own life. The grocery order was the first thing I stopped. It was subtle, almost invisible, and that was precisely the point. We had a standing weekly order from a delivery service she'd set up years ago. I simply didn't place it 1 week. She noticed by day 2, opened the refrigerator, stood there looking at the bare shelves, and asked if I'd forgotten. I said I'd probably just lost track of the day. She ordered takeout for herself that night. Didn't ask what I was eating. I made scrambled eggs at 10:30 and ate them standing at the kitchen counter. And I thought about what it meant, that she hadn't wondered. Then I stopped initiating conversation. Not coldly, not rudely. I simply stopped being the one who asked questions. No more how was your meeting? No more what do you feel like for dinner? No more did you hear the thing on the radio? I became a perfect echo. If she spoke, I responded. If she didn't, neither did I. The silence that followed was instructive. She lasted 4 days. Before she started filling it herself, asking me things she'd never bothered to ask before. How I'd slept, whether my back was still bothering me, what I was reading. She was reaching for me, because she'd realized the warmth was gone, and didn't know why. I gave her mild, pleasant, unrevealing answers. She got nothing she could hold. I watched her grow restless. She rearranged the living room furniture one afternoon. She signed up for a running club she'd never mentioned wanting to join. She started leaving notes on the kitchen counter. Small, ordinary things, the kind of notes we used to leave each other in the early years. She came and sat beside me on the couch one Sunday and suggested we take a weekend trip somewhere to reset. Her word, reset. As though a marriage could be restarted with a scenic drive and a hotel breakfast. I told her I'd think about it. I never brought it up again. She waited for me to, and didn't. Then I printed the photograph. I didn't print it digitally, not on a home printer. I had it developed at a pharmacy 2 towns over. Matte finish. Her and the man at the hotel entrance. her smiling up at him with an ease and an openness I had not seen directed at me in 2 years. It was a good photograph, technically. The light was soft. The composition was almost elegant in its betrayal. I placed it inside a plain card envelope. No note inside, just the image. She told me on a Friday afternoon that she was attending a baby shower for a woman from her office. She dressed carefully for it, more carefully than you dress for a baby shower, in a floral wrap dress, and the perfume she'd stopped wearing around the house months ago. She left at 2 in the afternoon. I waited 10 minutes, and then I placed the envelope in the second drawer of her vanity, just under the layer of makeup brushes, far enough down that she wouldn't encounter it while rushing, close enough that she'd find it the next time she sat down to get ready alone. Then I packed a bag with 3 days' worth of clothes, my laptop, my charger, and Cliff, a 7-year-old rescue dog she'd always tolerated but never loved, and I drove north to my college roommate's cabin outside of Ashford. For hours. No note. Phone on until I reached the property. Then switched off. I arrived to pine trees and a creek and a wood stove, and absolutely nothing that reminded me of her. Cliff slept on the floor beside the bed. I chopped wood I didn't need to chop. I walked trails without a destination. I slept 9 hours both nights without setting an alarm. And I thought slowly and carefully about the rest of my life. When I turned my phone back on, there were 17 missed calls and 11 text messages. The early ones were checking-in messages, vague and controlled, the voice of someone who didn't yet know what they'd found. Then the tone changed. "Did you go through my things?" A simple line, no punctuation. And then, "I need you to call me. I need to understand." I drove home the next morning. She was in the front hall when I came through the door, standing in her robe with bare feet, and eyes that had not slept well, maybe at all. She asked why I'd left the photo that way. I hung my jacket on the hook and walked past her to the kitchen. I told her I'd always heard that she hated to be surprised, so I tried to make it something she'd be prepared for. She followed me, asking questions I didn't answer. How long had I known? Had I followed her? What was I planning to do? I poured myself a glass of cold water and looked at her over the rim of the glass and said that there was nothing to plan, that she had already done everything herself. I left the kitchen before she could respond. That night she cooked dinner. This was significant. She made a chicken dish with a cream sauce she knew I liked, set the table with cloth napkins and a lit candle, put on the soft background music we used to have on when we had people over. It was a performance, and part of me recognized that and filed it somewhere careful. I ate the food. I said it was good because it was. Halfway through the meal she told me that whatever had been happening was over. She said it was nothing that had turned into something it shouldn't have, that she wanted to fix us, if there was still something to fix. I asked her what she'd thought would happen. She looked at the candle for a long time. Then she said she'd thought she could keep it separate, that she could maintain both things, without either one destroying the other. I watched her try to find words for what she'd done, and I watched her fail to locate them. She called it a situation. She called it complicated. She never once called it what it was. I told her I was going to need a few days. She nodded like that was encouraging. Like a few days meant we were negotiating, rather than concluding. I found her sitting on the floor of the walk-in closet at 11 that night. Her knees were pulled to her chest, and in front of her, not open, just there, sat the shoebox where she'd always kept the handwritten letters I used to write her early in our relationship. Holiday notes, birthday notes, one very long letter from when I'd traveled for work for 3 weeks. And she'd said she felt the distance in her chest. I watched her staring at that box from the doorway, without her knowing I was there. She wasn't reading anything. She was just looking at the box, like it was the last evidence of a person she vaguely remembered being. That image stayed with me longer than I expected. But it didn't change what I had already put into motion. The next morning I called a leasing office for a building across the city. 1 bedroom, 7th floor, corner unit, with a view of the water tower and the park. I wired the deposit using my personal account. Signed the agreement. I did not view the apartment in person first. I trusted the floor plan. That afternoon, I packed a single suitcase. Just the essentials. The things that were mine in the plainest sense of the word. I left behind the shirts folded the wrong way, the shoes that had been given to me as gifts rather than chosen, the decorative objects that were hers in taste, even if they'd been purchased jointly. I did not take down the wedding photograph from the hallway. I didn't turn it toward the wall. I did not make that moment mean anything more than the quiet I could preserve by treating it with indifference. I left one envelope on her side of the bed. Inside was a printed document, showing a transfer of funds from our joint account, exactly half the balance divided cleanly. Beneath the numbers I had written 4 words. This is what fairness looks like. And then I walked out. No slam of the door. No significant pause on the threshold. Just the soft mechanical click of a door closing behind me, and the warm evening air on my face, and my car waiting in the driveway, like a patient and uncomplicated thing. I want to tell you what it felt like to drive away from that house. It did not feel like loss. It felt like surfacing, like the moment after you've held your breath longer than you thought you could, and your lungs finally remember their purpose. The city moved past my windows, and I drove with the radio off, and my hands loose on the wheel, and I thought about the fact that I had no idea what came next, and found that, for the first time in years, that uncertainty didn't frighten me. The first 48 hours in the new apartment were quieter than I knew how to process. Bare walls, a mattress on the floor for the first 2 nights, while the frame I'd ordered was delivered. A leaky faucet in the bathroom that I actually found comforting in some way I couldn't explain. Cliff explored every corner of every room, and then settled near the window to watch pigeons. I made coffee in a pot I bought at a drugstore on the walk from the parking garage. I ate crackers and canned soup for dinner, and it tasted better than the chicken marsala had. She posted on her social media from the house. I checked once, only once in those first days. A photograph taken from the backyard, her standing in the grass barefoot, the late afternoon light catching her hair. The caption said something about still being here. Within an hour, there was a comment from a name I recognized. The man in the dark jacket, commenting on her posts now, openly, as though the situation had been resolved in his favor. I considered what I felt about that, and found it was less than I expected. What I felt more strongly was something adjacent to clarity. The clean, colorless clarity of a person who has finally read the fine print on something they signed a long time ago. I didn't react publicly. I did something more specific instead. I called my sister, Vera, who had spent years carefully not saying things she clearly thought, who had watched our marriage from a family distance, with an expression I had always interpreted as reservation, but now understood was barely contained fury. I called her on a Thursday evening, and I told her everything. Not the emotional version, the factual one, the hotel, the photograph, the calendar, the cologne I didn't own, the bolt on the bedroom door, the note that said still thinking about this morning, the man in the jacket commenting on the posts, the ceramics class that never produced ceramics. Vera was quiet through most of it. Then she said, with a steadiness that surprised me, "What do you want to happen?" I told her I wanted the truth to have air. What came next was not something I orchestrated in detail. I gave Vera access to the encrypted folder on my drive, the screenshots, the calendar inconsistencies, the photograph, the GPS metadata from a photo she'd posted, from what she'd called a wellness conference, but which my research had placed 40 minutes, from the man's publicly listed business address. I gave it to Vera and I stepped back. She posted an account of it on a relationship forum she'd been part of for years. She changed the names, altered identifying details, but kept the emotional truth intact. The hotel and the ceramics class, and the cologne, and the 53 days of not being touched. and the red heart emoji, and the careful, deliberate disappearance of a woman from a marriage she was still physically occupying. The response was significant. Within a day, there were hundreds of comments. Within 2 days, people were sharing it across platforms. Someone cross-referenced a slightly blurred background in one of her social media photos with publicly available imagery of a hotel exterior and identified it correctly. She didn't know that her own aesthetically curated images had been placing her in specific locations for months. Her accounts went down, all of them simultaneously, late on a Wednesday afternoon. Not deactivated, deleted, which is a longer and more deliberate process that tells you something about the nature of the panic behind it. She called me once that afternoon. I let the call go. Then she sent a single text message. "You said you wouldn't do this." I replied with one sentence. "I didn't do anything. I simply stopped doing the things that were protecting you from your own choices." She didn't answer. I went for a walk instead. 40 minutes through the neighborhood near my new apartment, past the bookstore with the good window displays, past the small park where old men played chess on weekend mornings, past the sandwich place with a handwritten daily special on a chalkboard outside. The city was warm and going about its business, and it had absolutely nothing to do with her. And that was, in that moment, an almost unbearable relief. The first time she came to my apartment building, I didn't answer the buzzer. I watched the entry camera feed on my phone from the couch. She stood at the door for 11 minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't kick the door or shout my name into the intercom. She stood with her arms folded, looking at the camera housing above the entrance, like she was aware she might be visible, and was trying to perform the correct version of herself for an unknown audience. After 11 minutes, she left. I watched the feed until she was around the corner and out of frame. A week later, she appeared at my sister's apartment. This I heard about secondhand, in detail, because Vera called me immediately after it happened. She said she had come to her door and asked if they could clear the air. Vera looked at her for a long moment, and then handed her a sealed envelope, and told her the sidewalk needed clearing more urgently. Inside the envelope was something Vera had received 2 days earlier, from a woman we both knew peripherally, someone on the outskirts of the social circle that had surrounded our marriage. That woman had finally decided to forward a group chat thread she'd been sitting on for months. It was a conversation between my wife and 3 of her closer friends. The timestamps were from the previous spring. The messages were revelatory. She talked about me in them, the way you'd talk about a piece of furniture you'd stopped noticing. She joked about the hotel weekends. She used the word checked out to describe me, in a way that made clear she viewed my emotional availability not as something she'd eroded, but as a character flaw I'd arrived with. And then there was a line, one specific line, that I have thought about many times since I read it. The beautiful thing about him is that he'll never escalate. He'll just quietly disappear and let me have whatever I want. I read that line sitting on the floor of my apartment kitchen at midnight, with Cliff asleep across my feet. I read it 3 times, and then I said out loud, to no one in particular, to the ceiling, to whatever version of myself existed in that room. You were right about one part. I did disappear, but it wasn't the way you meant. She sent a lawyer's letter 4 weeks later. It arrived in my mailbox at the new apartment building, forwarded from the old address by the postal service. Clean white envelope. No urgency in the exterior. Just the formality of consequence arriving by mail. Inside was a petition for divorce, signed in her full name, not the name she'd shared with me for 8 years, but her birth name, reclaimed and reaffirmed, as though I were already a parenthetical in her personal history, as though the years had been a temporary loan. She was returning with interest. I read the document the same evening it arrived, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. What I felt was something simpler. Recognition. This was the sentence that had been quietly forming for a long time. And now it was done. And now I knew what it said. I signed the papers the next morning, drove them to the post office myself, sealed in a plain envelope. No return address. There was nothing left to wait for in that direction. I want to tell you what the months after looked like. Not the dramatic parts, because there weren't many of those. The drama had already played out, and I had refused to be its loudest character. What came after was slower and stranger, and more important than any of the confrontations. I started painting again. I had painted through my 20s. Nothing serious, just the act of putting color on a surface, as a way of existing inside an afternoon, without needing to produce anything. I'd let it go somewhere around the second year of our marriage, because she found the garage smell unpleasant, and the cleanup disruptive, and I'd thought that was a reasonable compromise at the time. I didn't think about it much, until one Saturday morning when I found myself standing in front of the hardware store with nothing specific to buy, and I walked in and came out with brushes and canvas board, and 3 colors I thought looked honest. The first few things I made were genuinely bad. Landscapes where the horizon line tilted, trees that looked like broccoli, a sunset over the lake near my cousin's property that somehow ended up resembling a hot air balloon accident. I loved every one of them with a ferocity that surprised me, not because they were good, but because they were mine. I had made them without asking anyone's permission, without adjusting them to suit anyone's aesthetic, without checking whether they were acceptable. They were just what I had felt like making. On an afternoon that belonged entirely to me, I ran into a woman named Josephine at the bookstore near my apartment. About 6 weeks after I moved in, she managed the place, had been running it for 4 years, and had strong opinions about shelving methodology that she expressed without hesitation. When she found me quietly reorganizing a section by color palette, instead of the established system, she didn't ask me to stop. She stood next to me for a moment, considered the effect, and said, "I do that when I'm avoiding thinking about something." "What are you avoiding?" I told her I wasn't sure yet, which was the most honest thing I'd said to a stranger in years. We talked for an hour that day, about books and about cities, and about the particular exhaustion of realizing you've been performing a version of yourself for so long that you've forgotten what you look like without the costume. She'd been through a difficult end to a long relationship 2 years before, and she talked about it the way you talk about a place you used to live, with residual warmth and no desire to return. I told her about the divorce on the 3rd time we got coffee together. I didn't want to let her form a picture of me. That would require correction later. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment and said, "You don't seem broken. You seem like someone who just came from somewhere difficult and is still learning how to walk on level ground." That was exactly right. 6 months after I last set foot in the house I'd shared with her, I went back to the lake in central Montana, where we'd once taken a photograph together on a dock. At the end of a late summer afternoon, she had referenced that photo in a social media post months ago, after everything had already happened, accompanied by a caption about things she couldn't recover, and the quiet way I'd once been the architecture of her life. I'd read it once and left it alone. I drove to the lake on a weekend in early September, by myself, with a painting I'd made the week before. I had spent 4 hours on it. The dock, the tree line, the late light on the water, and a figure standing at the edge of it. Not posed, not dramatic, just present, just existing somewhere peaceful, without needing it to mean anything. I stood on the dock. Same angle of afternoon light, same slight wind off the water, everything the same, except the weight of her, which was not there. I felt the absence of it, like a door you've been pressing against your whole life, that suddenly isn't there, and the stumble forward into open space, and the strange standing upright inside all that room. I left the painting on a picnic bench at the edge of the dock. I taped a small note to the back of the canvas. Whoever you were is not a cage. You can walk out anytime you decide you're ready. I don't know who found it. I drove home as the light was going, and stopped at a diner on the highway, and ate eggs and toast at a counter by the window, and watched the last of the daylight leave the sky, and thought about absolutely nothing in particular, which is one of the finest things a person can learn to do again. After a long time of thinking about something constantly, I don't hate her. I want to be clear about that because it matters. The absence of hatred is not indifference. And it's not forgiveness exactly. It's something more specific than either of those. It's the recognition that someone can cause tremendous damage and still be a person who is simply bad at being honest, bad at choosing accountability over comfort, bad at understanding that other people's love is a real and finite resource that can be used up. She was not a monster. She was someone who couldn't face herself and turned me into a surface to face instead. But here is what I know now, 6 months out, in my own apartment, with my dog at my feet, and a painting drying on the easel in the corner, and coffee from the shop downstairs, and a whole morning that belongs to exactly and only me. Love is not a thing you earn by making yourself small enough to be kept. Loyalty is not a reason to remain past the point where you recognize that your presence is being treated as a given rather than a gift. Your gut, the part of you that counted 53 days before your brain had caught up, that part does not lie. It just waits for you to be ready to listen. And if someone tells you clearly, through action or inaction, or the particular way they stop letting you touch them, if someone tells you they've already left, don't chase, don't perform, don't reorganize yourself into someone more convenient. Just leave the door open and walk through it yourself. The closure I was waiting for from her never came in the form I expected. There was no real reckoning, no final conversation that tied it clean. There was just paperwork, and silence, and time, and the gradual return of a self I'd almost convinced myself no longer existed. I didn't need her to close it. I closed it myself. I closed it on that dock with the painting and the note for a stranger, and the drive home in the long autumn dark. I closed it the first morning I made coffee in my own kitchen, without checking to see if the sound of the grinder would disturb someone. I closed it every time I chose myself quietly, without making it a statement, without asking for acknowledgement. And that, in the end, was the most honest thing I ever gave myself. A goodbye that didn't wait for permission.